actions designed to strangle and, in fact, in this case, also terrorize a country for reasons that are understood. It's a very free country, the United States. We have a huge documentary record. It's all come out triumph of U.S. democracy that we have such records. It's not a triumph of U.S. democracy that nobody knows about it. That's different. That's a condemnation of the educational system and the media and so on. But if you look at the records, which are available, you find the reasons. It didn't have anything to do with the Russians. It was because of what they called 40 years ago Cuba's successful defiance of U.S. policies going back 150 years, namely to the Monroe Doctrine, which established that the U.S. runs the hemisphere. And Cuba was carrying out successful defiance of this, and therefore they should be subject to massive terrorism, economic strangulation, leading right up to the present. Well, that's what you can know if you want to find out. As I say, these things are perfectly well known in Latin America, as are many other things. So, for example, in Latin America, rarely here, there were plenty of commemorations last couple of weeks ago of what's called in Latin America the other 9/11, namely the 30 years ago, the bombing of the presidential palace in Chile, which led immediately to the death of, by very conservative estimates, about 3,000 people, probably many more than that. 3,000 in Chile would be the equivalent of about 60,000 in the United States, and we might consider it significant if 60,000 people were killed in the United States in a day of terror, but here it's not significant, primarily because the U.S. was instrumental in carrying out the terror, so therefore it didn't happen. That's let alone what happened later. However, for the rest of the world, it happened, and in particular in Latin America, it happened, and they know about it. Well, that's an opening to the second aspect, freedom and democracy abroad. The current administration is called often neo-Reaganite. It's a good term because they are mostly recycled from the Reagan administration or the Bush 1 administration. The term neo-Reaganite in the media, professional literature, and so on, that refers to what the New York Times called Reagan's yearning for democracy, which is now fortunately revived. So once again, we have a yearning for democracy. It was revived most recently in a speech by George Bush a couple of weeks ago, in which he announced that the United States is dedicated to democracy in Iraq, in the Middle East, all over the world, organizing a new crusade for democracy, real turning point in American policy. Well, that speech was greeted in the U.S. by commentators and to some extent in England with reverential awe, particular awe for the leading visionary who's running the crusade, Paul Wolfowitz. There's an interesting column. There are many, but one that I recommend to you if you haven't seen it is in the Washington Post on November 2nd by their leading political commentator, long-time political analyst, David Ignatius. While you're reading it, you have to keep pinching yourself to remind yourself that you're not in North Korea, but have a look. It's worth looking at, tells you something about the country. A great awe for this magnificent declaration and for what it proves, namely that the invasion of Iraq was the noblest war in history, undertaken for purely altruistic motives, just to bring democracy to suffering people. The awe was particularly directed at Paul Wolfowitz, described as a grand visionary, whose heart bleeds for the suffering, I'm quoting it, his heart bleeds for the suffering of Arabs. It's why he does such wonderful things. So it continues. There actually was, a couple of days later, by accident, the Washington Post published a poll just taken in Iraq, in which people were asked, among other things, why they thought the United States, they didn't use the word invade, whatever they said, but why the United States invaded Iraq. And there were people who agreed with the Washington Post and David Ignatius that the U.S. entered to bring democracy, 1%. So it wasn't zero. Well, interesting fact, one of many. But we might ask why, how come, or we might ask how other people reacted in the Middle East. Well, they reacted with complete ridicule. In fact, all over the world, outside the United States and to a little limited extent England, the reaction to Bush's speech was simply ridicule. Well, how can that be if we greet it with awe and reverence? Probably the reason is that other people don't understand that the magnificence of the United States is true by definition, so facts just don't matter. And they may have looked at the facts. For example, some of them may actually have read Bush's speech, where he listed countries of the Middle East and ranked them in terms of their progress toward democracy. Well, as was very quickly pointed out, the ranking had absolutely nothing to do with their progress toward democracy. In fact, it was often the opposite. But it had everything to do with whether they were following orders. The more they were following orders, the more they were advancing toward democracy, even if they were increasing torture and so on and so forth. Well, people notice that if they're not properly educated like we are. We don't notice it. Also, it really takes a very good education to miss the fact that there is exactly one elected leader in the Middle East. A leader elected in a reasonably fair election, but internationally supervised, and everybody said it's a fair election. His name happens to be Yasser Arafat. He's the one elected leader in the Middle East. Well, how does that get treated by the Bush administration and Paul Wolfowitz and their visionary efforts to bring democracy? Simple, kick him out. Why? Because he isn't doing his job. He was allowed to take over on one condition, namely that he control the population and permit Clinton and the Israeli government to carry out the settlement and development operations in the occupied territories, which are gradually integrating it under Israeli control and have to continue. In fact, in Clinton's last year, the year 2000, when everyone was falling over themselves about the magnificence of his offers, which were incidentally you never saw one single map of the proposal in the United States because it gives the game away. But in that last year, Clinton's last year, also Barack's last year, settlement activity reached its peak in the occupied territories, meaning building what are called facts on the ground. Well, Arafat's job was to keep the population quiet while this was happening. And as long as he did it, he was just fine. Nobody cared how many people he tortured. Nobody cared about the vast corruption, which was enormous. He could do anything he liked, as long as he did his job, keeping the population quiet. When he failed to do that job, to make the slightest bit of difference that he's popularly elected and agreed to be the most popular political figure, it just doesn't matter. Toss him out, bring in somebody who the U.S. wants, who they agreed quite openly, didn't have any political support, but maybe he would do the job. So that's our contribution to democracy in the last few months in the Middle East. Well, not everyone is as well educated and as disciplined as we are. So they look at this and they look at the speech and they fall into the aisles in laughter. It's one of the problems with lacking education. Another problem they have is that they may have a little historical memory. So, for example, there may be people who can actually remember something as far back as, say, 4 or 5 months ago, when quite an interesting episode took place in the United States. I can't even think of an analog to it. There was a display of brazen hatred and contempt for democracy almost throughout the entire spectrum in the U.S., which I just can't think of anything like it. That was the story right before, during the Iraq War about old Europe and new Europe. You'll remember that. So old Europe are the really bad guys, like France and Germany. And new Europe are the good guys, like Berlusconi and Aznar, who are the grand Churchillian figures leading the world to democracy, in contrast to also some of the East European satellites were allowed in. They were also grand figures, the former Russian satellites. That's New Europe. What was the criterion that distinguished New Europe from Old Europe? I mean, again, it takes a good education not to see it. It was very precise. Old Europe, the bad guys, are the countries where the governments took the same position as the large majority of the population. New Europe, the good guys, or leading the way to democracy, are the countries where the leaders overruled an even larger majority of the population in virtually every case and took their orders from Crawford, Texas. So therefore, they're Democrats. And this passed without a comment, almost. Some of the press was a little honest about it, like the Wall Street Journal, which often is more honest. They have a more trustworthy audience, I guess. So they actually quoted the foreign minister of Latvia, who was asked why Latvia went along with the United States when the population was overwhelmingly opposed. And he said, well, you know, we know that you have to say yes, sir, and do what they tell us to do. They've had some experience with that. And so they understand that that's how you get democratic credentials. After all, they were a people's democracy, so they know how democracy works. But for the most part, this passed without any comment. Actually, the most interesting case was Turkey. Turkey, about 95% of the population opposed involvement of the war, and to everyone's amazement, including mine, the Turkish government actually went along with 95% of the population. They were immediately denounced bitterly by Colin Powell, the administration moderate, who announced they were going to be punished by cutting back loans, and so on. Commentators all across the press condemned them for literally lacking democratic credentials because they were not taking orders from Washington and doing what 95% of the population wanted without a flicker of embarrassment. The most extreme was Paul Wolfowitz. Paul Wolfowitz actually denounced the Turkish military for not intervening as they could to prevent the government from keeping to the will of 95% of the population. That's the visionary leading the way to democracy. Well, it's all there. All you have to do is put it together, and there are people who somehow notice those things. What about Wolfowitz's heart bleeding for the poor, suffering Muslims? And that must explain why he was one of the strongest supporters and advocates of General Suharto, first as ambassador under Reagan, and then continuing afterwards as late as 1997, just a couple of months before Suharto was overthrown by an internal revolt. Suharto ranks right along with Saddam Hussein. You know, he's one of the worst mass murderers and torturers of the latter part of the 20th century. But he was doing his job. He was opening up his rich country to Western exploitation. So it didn't matter how many hundreds, thousands of people he killed or how many people were rotting away in jail for decades and being tortured and so on and so forth. Wolfowitz's heart was bleeding for the poor, suffering people by lauding the mass murderer and torturer. That's not the only part of his history. Maybe other people have memory that goes back a little further to the days when he was in Reagan's State Department with responsibility for Asia. So that meant that he was supporting Marcos, dictator Chun in South Korea, both brutal killers and torturers, and right to the end of their rule. I mean, there's now a reconstruction of history, but if you look at the actual history, yes, that's what it was, right to the end until they simply could not be maintained any longer because they were being overthrown by internal revolt. You can't, however, blame him for some other things. So you can't blame him for supporting Duvalier till the end, or Ceausescu, who was easily the counterpart of Saddam Hussein and was supported right to the day of his final overthrow by the Reagan and Bush administration. It's one of their favorites, in fact. Noriega, a rather minor thug who they supported, and quite a cast of quite an interesting rogues gallery. Take a look at the people who are supported by the current incumbents in Washington. It's pretty impressive. Right to the time that they were overthrown, strongly supported. And the rogues gallery gets new names every day. So not long ago, the ruler of Equatorial Guinea, Obiang, was welcomed in the White House. Again, terrible torturer and killer, but sitting on a large pool of oil. So he was welcomed, and in fact actually had an election in which he won 97% of the vote. Another current favorite is Karimov in Uzbekistan, who's, again, properly compared with Saddam Hussein, gotten worse and worse since the US started supporting him. Recently, the British ambassador was recalled from Uzbekistan because he had the temerity to condemn the dictator and describe, for example, the way he gets rid of his opponents by boiling them to death. So he was taken back to London to teach him some manners. So we can add him. And so it continues without change, right alongside the, the reverence for the new love of democracy and the visionaries carrying it forward. Well, you also can't blame Wolfowitz for the support of the current incumbents for Saddam Hussein. That's Rumsfeld, Powell, Cheney. Bush 1 administration supported their favorite killer in the region right through his worst atrocities because they didn't care. Now they claim to be upset about them, but not at the time. Continued to support him, provide him with means for developing weapons of mass destruction. Long after the war with Iran, had nothing to do with that. That's another excuse. In fact, they gave the reasons publicly. The reasons were, Bush #1 explained, his administration, the reasons for supporting Saddam after the atrocities, after the war, was our responsibility to American exporters. So it doesn't matter how many people they gas or kill, we have a responsibility to support American exporters. If they want to help them develop weapons of mass destruction, it's our responsibility. If you take a look at the statements, they also added the usual boilerplate about how supporting Saddam Hussein will help improve the human rights situation and bring stability and so on and so forth. All on the public record, right up till the day of the invasion of Kuwait, in fact. Rarely reported, but it's in the public record. And then they returned to support for Saddam in 1991. Now you read, agonized reports of the hideous mass graves that are being unearthed in southern Iraq. Thomas Friedman uses that to demonstrate that it really was a moral war. He's agonizing over the mass graves, which he knew about perfectly well in the spring of 1991. It was perfectly well known. That's when the US authorized Saddam to crush an internal rebellion that might have overthrown him. The reasons were explained in print, for example, by Thomas Friedman, who approved of it, because, as he put it, the best of all worlds for the United States would be an iron-fisted military junta which would rule Iraq just the way Saddam did. He's kind of an embarrassment, but there isn't anyone else who will have to back him. While the main New York Times Middle East correspondent, Alan Cowell, explained that we have to, we're kind of upset about all the slaughter and terror and so on, but there is, he said, a near unanimous view, meaning the US accepts it, that Saddam offers better hope for the stability of Iraq than the people who are trying to overthrow him, meaning we don't want Iraqis to rule Iraq. And if we can't do it, we'd rather have Saddam. All of that's in the papers. You can read it. In 1991, while the mass graves were being filled by Saddam's terror, authorized by the US, now the time has come to agonize over them and to talk about how awful this was, and we have to have the noblest war in history because of it. And no one will be so unkind as to mention what the same people wrote when they knew all about it as it was happening. And they could have stopped it if they'd wanted. Well, another tribute to the discipline of properly educated people. You also can't blame Wolfowitz for Africa. That was the specialty of administration moderates like Colin Powell, for example. During the Reagan administration in Africa, in the countries neighboring South Africa, Angola and Mozambique, in those countries, about 1.5 million people were killed and over $60 billion of damage were caused by South African aggression and atrocities, supported by the United States. That's just during the Reagan years. Congress did impose constraints. It legislated sanctions against South Africa, but the Reagan administration found ways around them, and they were able to increase trade and support for South Africa afterwards. Meanwhile, condemning the Nelson Mandela's African National Congress as one of the more notorious terrorist organizations in the world. It was during the period when Powell was National Security Advisor. At the same time, the U.S. undermined the major UN effort to condemn terrorism. There were several, but the major one was in December 1987, a very strong resolution condemning terrorism in all its forms, calling on everyone to do everything possible to stamp out the plague. There were 2 votes against it, the United States and reflexively Israel. 1 country abstained, Honduras, probably the ambassador had a stomachache that day or something. Otherwise unanimous, but effectively vetoed. When the U.S. votes against a resolution, it's vetoed. In fact, doubly vetoed because it's also banned from reporting and banned from history, so it's unknown. Also unknown are the reasons why the United States and Israel banned the resolution against terror. They explained it in the General Assembly debate, again on the public record. The reason was 1 paragraph which said nothing in this resolution prejudices the right of people to struggle for their freedom under racist and colonialist regimes and foreign military occupation, in accord with the Charter of the United Nations and to gain support from others to do so. Well, the U.S. and Israel obviously couldn't support that paragraph because the phrase racist and colonialist regimes referred to the apartheid regime of South Africa, which they were supporting, and the foreign military occupation referred to the occupied territories, where you're not allowed to resist occupation because the U.S. supports it. Well, that's the major resolution on terrorism during a decade where terrorism was the lead issue, top issue of the day, war on terror, plague of the modern age, return to barbarism, etc. But we can't talk about this any more than we can talk about any of the other things I mentioned, because it's the wrong story for the United States, not for the rest of the world. What about Latin America, which was supposed to be where the triumph of Reagan's yearning for democracy was taking place? Well, it was kind of the poll that I mentioned in Iraq, where 1% agreed with U.S. columnists and commentators that the U.S. entered Iraq to preserve democracy. That poll also had a more interesting answer, which shows some sophistication. In one of the questions in the poll, about half the population said the United States would support democracy in Iraq, but would control it. Okay. Well, that's sophisticated. That shows an understanding of history. It's not hard for Iraqis to have that understanding. They've had a century of experience with it. Since Iraq was created by the British, it was to be free and independent and had its own parliament and everything else, except that, as the British internal secret records described it, and Iraqis knew without bothering to read secret records, Iraq, like other countries in the region, was to be run by what the British called an Arab facade. which would carry out local administration and management, while the British effectively ruled from behind the scenes, behind one or another constitutional fiction, as they put it, like, say, democracy. The locals would be allowed to, tow cars that are illegally parked, for example, and other such activities. But if they ever got out of line, British muscle would be there to make sure they get back into line. And that's the kind of democracy the Iraqis, for some odd reason, expect the United States to institute, partly because of their own history, but partly because they may, for example, know something about the history of Latin America, including during the Reagan era of yearning for democracy. Americans are uniquely unaware of what happened there. It's known in most of the world, not here. Actually, it is known here a little bit. So, for example, there's some important scholarly work on the Reagan yearning for democracy. The most important work on it, in fact, is done by a Latin American scholar, Thomas Carruthers, who wrote the main books and articles, who's interesting particularly because he's also an insider. He was working inside the Reagan State Department in their, what they call, democracy enhancement programs. So he's writing both as an insider and as a scholar describing what happened. He says the policies were very sincere, as I'm sure they were, just as sincere as Stalin's policies of bringing democracy to Eastern Europe. Actually, we have good evidence that those were sincere because the released Russian archives that are coming out, which are mostly pretty boring, do have some interesting things, like the discovery that internally they talked the same way they did externally. So it meant they're probably sincere when they talked about the need to preserve democracy in Eastern Europe, to protect it against fascism and so on and so forth. Yeah, probably very sincere. Carruthers is probably right to say that the yearning for democracy was sincere in the Reagan State Department, but he says it was a failure. He also is honest enough to point out that it was a systematic failure in a very striking way. In the southern cone of Latin America, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, in the southern cone where the United States had least influence, there was progress toward democracy, which the Reagan administration opposed every step of the way, but finally had to accept because it was just taking place anyway. On the other hand, in the region nearer the United States, where the U.S. had more control, in fact almost total control, he said the progress was least. In fact, virtually none, because the U.S., as he puts it, would only tolerate top-down forms of democracy in which traditional elites who were linked to the United States would remain in power. In other words, you could have pretty much what the Iraqis expect. Formal democracy, that's good for public relations purposes, as long as you're guaranteed that they do what you tell them. And that's just what's happened in Iraq. Again, it doesn't take a genius to recognize that democracy is going to be given to Iraq under certain conditions. The occupying authorities have already imposed an economic plan which no sovereign country would ever accept. It opens up the country to complete takeover by foreign corporations, mainly U.S. corporations and banks. Some Iraqis will benefit, namely the local collaborators with the foreign owners. That's the way the imperial system has always worked. Plenty of people benefit in the poorest country you like in the world, Southern Africa, anywhere else. There's a rich sector which lives at an incredible level of luxury. Yeah, that's the traditional elites linked to foreign power. And yes, that'll happen in Iraq, but no independent development. It's all under foreign, mainly U.S. control. The economic plan that was imposed illegally, incidentally, it's in strict violation of the Geneva Conventions on Occupying Powers. That doesn't bother anyone either. That plan so far has left out the oil industry because that would just be too blatant. So it'll happen indirectly and slowly in other ways. They also announced at once, as soon as the democracy lecture was given, that the government of Iraq, the democratic government, would agree, and wouldn't have any choice about it, to what amounts to a status of forces agreement of the usual sort, guaranteeing the right of American military forces to stay there as long as they like, and to establish military bases there, permanent military bases, right at the heart of the oil-producing region. That's extremely significant. Carruthers' account of democracy in Latin America is accurate. The Iraqis understand it even without reading internal records of the British or academic studies in the United States, because it's their own history. And most of the people in the world understand it from just their own lives. It's only here where we're not allowed to understand it, much too dangerous. I should say that despite all this, there have been improvements. The changes in American society over the past 40 years, which are significant, reflect themselves in the way these matters are dealt with. So, for example, no American president today could possibly carry out the kinds of terrorist atrocities in, say, Cuba that Kennedy could carry out without anyone batting an eyelash. The country's just too civilized. And there's interesting examples, very striking examples, which ought to be on the front pages of the newspapers, but you can figure out even though they're not there. So take Brazil, the most important country in Latin America. They just carried out an achievement which is quite astonishing, and from which we ought to try to learn something if we're actually interested in democracy. They carried out an achievement in democracy which is unimaginable in the United States. The popular movements developed over the past 20 years under very harsh conditions. It's a brutal and repressive state, and they overcame not only harsh repression, but tremendous concentration of capital and of media, much beyond what we have, and elected their own president, who happens to be a very impressive figure. Nobody remotely like him in the US political system or the West anywhere. And they did it. That's a democratic achievement, which we can't imagine. In the United States, most of the population is well aware that elections are bought. You don't have people who represent the public. But in Brazil, they can do it. Well, again, that's something, for one thing, that ought to make us feel humiliated, but also from which we could learn if anybody cared about democracy. It's 40 years ago, under Kennedy, Brazil also had a populist president, nowhere near Lula, nothing like it, and with nowhere near as much popular support, but he was kind of a mildly populist president. Well, at that point, the Kennedy administration organized a military coup, which took place immediately after the assassination, but had already been placed in motion by John F. and Robert Kennedy, which instituted what's called a national security state, neo-Nazi state, torture, repression, violence. Brazil's an important country, so it had a domino effect throughout the continent. One of the effects was the other 9/11, which was one of the other military coups that followed in this. And they got rid of him. That threat was overcome. Today, there's no military coup planned in Brazil, though the threat to U.S. corporate and power interests is much greater. Why? Well, there are a number of reasons, and they're worth thinking about. One reason is that the population of the United States wouldn't tolerate it any longer, nor would the Brazilians, but we're talking about ourselves, which is what matters to us. People here would not tolerate a Kennedy-style military coup establishing a neo-Nazi state. It's just become too civilized, thanks to the activism of mostly young people in the 60s and the following years. It's one reason why the 60s are so bitterly condemned and denounced in the liberal press. So, for example, last Sunday's New York Times book review, but constantly. They're hated because they civilized the country. They got people involved in women's rights and environmental issues, opposition to aggression and violence. I mean, all kind of horrible things happened then. No wonder it's denounced. But it did change the country a lot, and people would not accept a Kennedy-style terrorist war or a Kennedy-style military coup. Those are not possible now. fortunately. That's progress. But there's another reason why there's no plan for a military coup. It's not needed. The actions of the Clinton administration and its predecessors in establishing international economic arrangements under the fraudulent cover of free trade has almost nothing to do with trade, but the international economic arrangements that are called neoliberal everywhere else in the world, here they're called free trade, it's a joke, and that you see in the World Trade Organization that were just brought up to be extended in the Miami atrocities that took place a couple of weeks ago. Those arrangements are very effective. They began around 30 years ago with the breakdown of the post-war international economic system, first by liberalization of capital flow and deregulation of currencies. Now, it was well understood that control over capital flows is critical to democracy. Keynes pointed out 70 years ago that unless there are controls over capital, as he put it, the experiment with democracy in the West is seriously in danger. And the reasons are obvious. When you have free flow of capital, free speculation, that creates what international economists call a virtual senate of investors and lenders who carry out a moment-by-moment referendum on government policy. And if the government is doing something they don't like, for example, improving health care instead of improving conditions for investment, they simply destroy the economy by attacking the currency, by capital flight, and other means. So they have a stranglehold over countries, which is a terrific way of preventing democracy. In fact, those rules on capital controls and regulated currencies were instituted after the Second World War in order to permit what we call welfare states, social democratic policies, give some range for governments to carry out policies which had enormous popular support after the war. It's taken a long time to break that down. It's slowly being broken down by corporate capital concentration, but it's taken time. One of the methods is to free up capital flow, break down financial controls, but there are others. Every element of the neoliberal package of what they're selling in Miami is intended to undermine democracy very explicitly. So take, say, privatization. Is there any economic reason for privatization? Not that anybody's ever shown. But there is a very good political reason for privatization. It's true, it's almost obvious by definition. If you privatize something, it's out of public control. It's out of the public arena. Okay? It's under the control of totalitarian institutions, unaccountable totalitarian institutions. That's what corporations are. Unaccountable totalitarian institutions with enormous power. Put something into their hands, it's out of the public arena. So that reduces the threat of democracy by definition. When it extends to what's called trade and services, mentioned before, things like water, then you're finished. Services means anything that any human being could be interested in, like water, for example, or health, or education, or roads, or name it. Anything that we care about is services. Trade in services is a euphemism. It means privatization of services. It means handing them over to totalitarian institutions that are unaccountable to the public. That's what trade and services means. As you push through trade and services, you narrow the public arena. You continue with this, you can end up with formal democracies, and in fact you don't even need terror anymore, or even control of opinion. You need nothing, because there's no public arena left. There's nothing for people to make decisions about. It's all in the hands of tyrannical institutions which are effectively unaccountable to the public. Well, that's called neoliberalism. It's also harmful to the economy, but that's secondary. Those are the methods. That's what's being discussed. That's what's at issue in places like Miami and Cancun and so on. Well, at this point, we're up to the major methods of controlling and undermining democracy, which have to do with the main mission of the organization that's running this event. Corporate control, obviously the most powerful institutions in the modern world. Plenty to say about them. Now we're at the heart of the problem, but now I'll stop. It's not about the title that was announced.
All right, well, thank you for seeing us today. And as you know, we want to talk really about ideas of anarchism and your thoughts on anarchism. And it's going to be a rather wandery chat,
okay,
but hopefully we'll get somewhere.
Yeah, see, never know.
All right. I think in the middle 90s, in an interview that you gave, you talked about one of the problems with anarchism was that maybe it was too negative. It criticised but didn't offer a positive.
Well, I don't. If I said that, I shouldn't have, because I don't agree with it.
Right.
In fact, you can take a look at the shelf up there.
Yes, I was. Yeah.
I mean, there are anarchist studies which offer proposals for society in such meticulous detail that they go beyond anything plausible, in my view. Like Abad de Santillán is a famous case. Who, in 1936, I guess, wrote a critique of the anarchist revolution in Spain, and he was an Argentine anarchist who was in Spain, and he, it's called After the Revolution or something like that, and he laid out a very detailed program for what a largely anarcho-syndicalist vision of Spanish society, or for that matter any society, ought to be like. And there are many other proposals. I mean, I think the question about detailed planning for the future is not so much can we do it? Sure, we can do it in lots of different ways, but whether we know enough about human beings, about society, about institutions, the effects of introducing institutional structures into human life. Do we know enough about that to be able to plan in any detail what a society should look like, or should it be an experimental, guided by certain general ideas about liberty and equality and authority and domination, and just let people explore different ways of working through this maze and see what comes natural to them, how much variety there should be. What are you going to do with people who don't want to work, or people with criminal tendencies, or people who don't want to go to meetings, and there's millions of questions that come up. To what extent do you want to interchange jobs or delegate responsibility on the basis of interest and talent and so on? I mean, if somebody wants to be a carpenter or a nuclear physicist or a pianist, and somebody else wants to be an administrator, do you necessarily require that they interchange jobs as a matter of principle, even if they're all happy or if they don't? I don't think we know. There's both positive and negative comments you can make about that, but I don't think we know the answers.
I was reading Isaac Puente, the Spanish libertarian communist theorist, who was arguing rather like that, and he was arguing that, well, if one becomes a teacher, one learns by experience, and if one becomes a doctor, one learns by experience. One isn't a doctor when one's 22. You learn, and maybe that's how anarchism ought to be seen.
Well, at a very general level, I think we would all agree that people in the rough range of